talk a little bit about the Nicaean Creed. It's important because things like the Da Vinci Code make people aware of it. Muslims bring up a straw man or historical revisionism about it. Even Protestants and Catholics that are nominal don't know much about it. And it's very important. So one myth is that Jesus and his divine nature was invented at Nicaea. It's completely false. Polycarp, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and others clearly showed Jesus is God before 325 Nicaea. Nicaea did not invent the books of the canon. That's also false. Nicaea 325, but was not in a vacuum. There was different theological streams or paradigms. Arius was not the first to be Arianism. Lucian of Antioch had a stream of Arianism before Arius, and probably several others that Lucian influenced. And so, to be more accurate, the kerosene was all over the ground. Arius just lit the flame that was inevitable. If Arius did not light the flame, someone else would have lit the flame because of the Christological tensions. And Origen, who was born more or less 180 to 250, 75 years before Nicaea, his Christology was ambiguous at times. That also did not help because he was such a big influence. He was very prolific. He wrote a lot. And so that did not help things leading up to Nicaea. And also, Origen's view of man, pre-existence of souls, did not help either. Because some people believed in pre-existent souls. People who rejected the pre-existence of souls went to an extreme that said that Jesus didn't have a human soul. Even Athanasius, when he wrote early on about some of the things about Christ, he omitted or didn't talk about Jesus' human soul. Now, that doesn't mean that Athanasius did not believe that Jesus had a human soul or didn't. It's an argument from silence. So you have to be very careful there. But there is theological, historical context. These things do not come in a vacuum. And so when we look at Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, had a run-in with Arius around, according to Louis Airy's book, 318 or 322. Anyways, there was most likely a small council in Alexandria, and that really didn't do much. And then there was a council in Antioch right before Nicaea, which Ascius of Cordoba most likely preceded over. Now, 325, Constantine had consolidated all the power. So he kind of preceded over Nicaea. He didn't think it was all that big of a deal, but he, anyways, you have all these bishops because at the end of the persecution around, 313, a lot of these bishops that a decade or so earlier were in persecution then came to Nicaea. And some of these bishops who apostatized during the persecution really didn't have much to say. Maybe a couple were invited to Nicaea, but they probably did not sign the Nicaean Creed, where I believe it was around 318 bishops or so signed the Nicaean Creed. It wasn't like a vote with your hand. It was, sign the creed. So going into the Nicene Creed, most of the people had a, generally speaking, view that Jesus is God. Now, Nicaea and preceding Nicaea, some of the problems is also the grammar of God. So, for example, in Nicene Creed, they talk about Jesus of the nature of the Father, homoousios. And for Arians, they turned around and said, oh, you guys are Sabellius, different modes, but you have no distinction within the Trinity within the Father, Son, Spirit, but you are more like what we would call modern day modalists. That would be some of their claim. And also, homoousios, used previously in the mid 2nd century by some Gnostics, had some bad connotations there also. And then there's also an argument that after Nicaea, things were not settled. There were still problems. The Nicene Creed mentions Jesus, true God of true God, begotten, not made, but it doesn't say eternally begotten. The word eternally is not there, so Arians jumped on that. So there's a lot of things to take in consideration, and then of course the politics, because eventually when Constantine died, his empire was split up between Constantine II, his oldest son, Constantius, middle son, and Constans, his younger son, who got part of Africa and Italy. And some of these guys favored more or less Arianism camp. Now, when Arius and Athanasius and others went at it in Nicaea, some of the people that were for Arius weren't totally agreeing with his theology. Because remember, again, at the end of the persecution of around 313 and leading up until 325, there was politics going on. There's also ecclesiastical structure going on, and some bishops in prison, and some other bishops trying to leverage for power, and other bishops didn't like that. So there's some of that going on for sure that caused some problems. And so, anyways, some people also just didn't like Athanasius' attitude. So, for example, the Meletians, if I'm pronouncing their name right, they didn't have a good theology, and Athanasius barred some of them from churches, put some of them into prison, more or less. There was even a claim that he murdered one, but then they produced the body, and he did not murder anybody. It was false. But they said, Athanasius did not allow these people to go to church, and he was very rough with them. And Athanasius didn't really even answer to the charges. Didn't have anything to do with these guys. And remember, he was exiled several times for various reasons. So Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. So much more to say, but all I can say is after Nicaea, these things did not go away. Athanasius later on wrote the oratory or orations against the Arians, and there he does, I think, mention once or twice. He does mention homoousios, and he does bring it back. Finally, brings it back to Nicaea. Now, the reason I say finally is because a lot of people neglected the word homoousios for about 20 years after Nicaea, because in extant manuscripts or a lot of stuff around that time, up to about 345, you don't hear a lot about Nicaea. Nicaea isn't necessarily meant to be initially a universal ecumenical council, because churches had catechumens and they had their own local churches and theology. So you could maybe look at Nicaea originally as a general guide for the church. And so someone like Hilary Poiters, who was a strong advocate for the Trinity, pro-Nicaea, after Nicaea, yeah, he seems to say that he didn't hear about Nicaea, or at least hear about it in a formal societal sense of outspoken that this is supposed to be like universal for all Christians. So you have to take that into consideration as well. So these arguments were going on to and forth after Nicaea. In the Nicene Creed, by the way, real quick, you didn't have as much talk on the Holy Spirit. A little bit was mentioned there in 325 Nicaea, but that also, for the modern day Nicene Creed 325, what we have today is also a combination of the Nicene Creed and with more substance or added specifics of the Holy Spirit. That was added in with the Council of Constantinople at 381. And so after Nicaea, you still have these theological trajectories, as some theologians like to call them, and the wrestling and tossing of those things, and trying to fill them out and trying to flatten out that theology more. And so Athanasius, Hilary of Poitiers, and others were pro Nicaean, especially the Cappadocian fathers, Basil the Great, Gregorian Nazianzus, guys that were basically modern day Turkey. And they used metaphysical arguments to better understand the Trinity against, things like Arianism and false Christologies. And so that's very important. What I want to hit on real quick, because again, this is just a short video. Arius died not too long after Nicaea. And so the Eusebians, this is another name for Arians, we have to talk about them briefly. So Eusebius of Nicomedia, which is northwest Turkey, he was very Arian-esque. His theology didn't agree exactly with Arius. Arius was the sun was created out of nothing for Arius. Eusebius of Nicomedia wasn't that strict, but still, it wasn't believe in the homoousion in the sense that the Father and the Son shared of the same substance, like modern day Trinitarians believe. And so he was along that route. And Eusebius of Caesarea, the one who wrote the ecclesiastical history, the church history, he was initially for Arius, and he was actually excommunicated in 325 at Antioch right before Nicaea, but then he was taken back in. He had to explain himself a little bit at Nicaea, but he signed the Nicene Creed. But he seemed to be, in some sense, against the way Athanasius went about things. So that was him there. And also, again, how did Eusebius of Caesarea read Origen? Because there's times he's very ambiguous. Even when you go back to Tertullian, you see the language of a fountain and a stream, a sun ray and the substance of the sun. But Tertullian was pretty much Trinitarian, okay? And Arians will try to use historical revisionism and try to downplay him. No, I would disagree with that. But going back to after Nicaea, post-Nicaea, yeah, when you get within the emperors and the struggle with politics and ecclesiastical structure and the metaphysics between homoousion, or we'll say heterousion, for those who did not believe that the eternal Son is of the same substance of the Father, or didn't even believe the Son was eternal at all. In some cases, we'll call them heterousion, or the Eusebian group there. And they became very problematic. And then some people who were part of that was Aetius, was Eusebian. He's part of the Lucian school of Antioch, the Arius school. Eunomius was a part of this group also. And so over time, you have more and more polemics and apologetics, and that's a good thing. And eventually, all this led up to would be Chalcedon or Chalcedon in 451 as well, in describing the hypostatic union. And that's for another video. So from 325 to 451, in about 125-year period, we don't have the technology and the internet and the stuff that we have today that people can... And we have people that might agree with the Christology, but have a very weird eschatology. And what do you do with that? And you have people supporting these people over here, and different emperors coming and going. And then eventually you have the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476. But that wasn't when the whole Roman Empire fell, because the Roman Empire gone on into the mid 15th century. People in the earliest 15th century still called themselves Romans. But anyways, that's that for now. Just wanted to bring that out in a nutshell and talk about that more over time, because those are the misconceptions that secularists have or Muslims have.